History remembers conquerors by the cities they take, but rarely does it ask what they were like before they became inevitable. Before Constantinople fell, before massive cannons shattered ancient walls, and before the course of East and West was changed forever, there was a boy. His name was Mehmed. He was born in 1432, into an empire that was powerful, but also incredibly fragile. The Ottomans ruled vast lands, yet they were surrounded by enemies, plagued by internal rivalries, and constantly living in the shadow of a city that had resisted every conqueror before them. Constantinople, too many. Capturing it was an impossible dream, but to Mehmed it was a destiny whispered into him from childhood. His father, Sultan Murad II, was a seasoned ruler who understood a crucial truth: raw strength alone was not enough. The future of the empire required intellect, so Mehmed was educated relentlessly. First came the languages: Arabic, Persian, Latin, Greek. Then came the subjects that forge a ruler's mind: history, philosophy, mathematics, and military science. While other children were out playing, Mehmed was studying maps. He was reading about Alexander the Great, about Caesar, about the rulers who had reshaped the world. But this brilliance came with a sense of isolation. Mehmed was not a gentle child. He was intense, quiet, incredibly observant. His teachers feared his sharp temper, but couldn't help but admire his mind. He questioned authority, challenged renowned scholars, and refused to accept simple answers for complex problems. Then, at just 12 years old, he became sultan, not because he was ready, but because the empire had no other choice. His father, Murad, had stepped aside, hoping that his abdication would bring peace. Instead, Europe sensed weakness. Crusader armies began to form on the horizon. Back in the capital, the advisors panicked. They whispered what no one dared say aloud. A child sat on the throne. Mehmed listened to it all, and he learned. When Murad was forced to return to power to save the empire, Mehmed was pushed back into the shadows. Officially, he was a prince again. Unofficially, he became a student of failure. He watched closely, observing how power could be lost in an instant. He saw how hesitation invited enemies to strike. He learned how legends were both made and broken. And in that time, he made a decision. If he ever ruled again, he would not rule carefully. He would rule decisively. When Murad II died in 1451, Mehmed descended the throne once more. This time, he was a man, 19 years old. Across Europe, leaders breathed a sigh of relief. They thought him inexperienced, too young, too ambitious for his own good. They were wrong, because Mehmed did not just want to inherit an empire, he wanted to complete it. And standing in his way was the one city that had humiliated kings and emperors for 1,000 years. Constantinople, the possession of his youth, was now the target of his manhood, and this time, he would not fail. When Mehmed became sultan for the second time, the world made a familiar mistake. They underestimated him. But this time, Mehmed didn't react, he simply observed. There, across the water, stood Constantinople, ancient, proud, and surrounded by walls that no army in history had ever truly managed to break. For over 1,000 years, this city had withstood everything thrown at it: sieges, crusades, plagues, and betrayals from within. Countless sultans had dreamed of taking it. Every single one had failed. Mehmed wanted to know why. He became a student of failure. Alone at night, he would trace maps by candlelight, poring over ancient texts. He calculated distances, supply lines, and every conceivable weakness. He read every account of every failed siege, not for inspiration, but to learn from their mistakes. And through this intense study, one truth became crystal clear: the legendary walls were not the real problem. The real problem was tradition. Armies kept attacking the same way, and the city kept resisting the same way. Mehmed decided it was time to change the rules of war itself. His first move was a shock to everyone. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fort. This new fortress, Rumeli Hisari, sent an unmistakable message. Constantinople was now officially surrounded. European envoys arrived, furious, lodging protests. Byzantine diplomats pleaded and begged. Mehmed ignored them all. His gaze was fixed on the city. Then, he made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He hired a man nobody else wanted, a brilliant but eccentric Hungarian engineer named Urban. Urban made an outrageous claim that he could build cannons larger and more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. Other rulers had dismissed him as a madman, his ideas too dangerous and unrealistic. Mehmed, however, saw the genius behind the ambition. He gave Urban unlimited resources, a blank check to turn his wild dreams into reality. What followed was a technological revolution. Cannons so enormous they were given names. Cannons that required teams of dozens of oxen just to move them a few feet. Cannons designed to shatter stone walls that had been considered indestructible for centuries. When the first test shot was fired, the explosion echoed for miles. People said it felt like the earth itself was trembling. Still, Mehmed knew cannons alone were not the answer. The Byzantine navy controlled a key waterway called the Golden Horn. Its entrance protected by a massive iron chain stretched across the water. No enemy ship had ever managed to pass it during a siege. It was the city's aquatic shield. So Mehmed conceived a plan so audacious, so outside the box, that no commander in history had ever attempted it. He decided that if he couldn't sail his ships past the chain, he would go over land. Under the cover of darkness, his engineers laid down a road of greased logs. Thousands of men and animals began the impossible task of dragging the Ottoman fleet across hills and through forests. It was a silent, Herculean effort. By morning, the Byzantines awoke to an unbelievable sight. Dozens of Ottoman ships were suddenly floating inside their impenetrable harbor. Panic swept through the city like a fire. It was a move straight out of a myth, and it broke their spirit. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI finally understood the man he was facing. This was not the reckless boy the world remembered. This was a new kind of ruler, one who blended cold intellect with shocking brutality, infinite patience with breathtaking audacity. As the spring of 1453 arrived, Mehmed gathered his army for a final speech. He didn't promise them an easy victory or endless riches. He promised them something far greater, a place in history. He told them that cities fall and empires crumble, but their names, the names of the men who were there, would endure. This moment, he declared, would echo long after their bones had turned to dust. Then, the great cannons were aimed. The final siege began, and the world held its breath. On April 6, 1453, a siege unlike any other began. This was the siege of Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, its legendary walls repelling countless invaders. But this time was different. This time, it faced Sultan Mehmed II. Every single morning, the world was woken by the thunder of Mehmed's colossal cannons. These weren't just ordinary cannons. They were monsters of bronze, hurling stone projectiles that weighed over half a ton. The ancient walls of Theodosius, which had never been breached, began to crack and crumble. Dust and shattered stone filled the air as centuries of engineering were pulverized by this new, terrifying technology. But Constantinople was defiant. The city's spirit was as strong as its walls had once been. By night, an incredible thing happened. The entire city came alive. Men, women, monks, nobles, soldiers, everyone worked together. Under the flickering light of torches, they hauled stones, patched breaches, and reinforced the damaged sections. They prayed as they labored, their will to survive seemingly unbreakable. Every morning, the Ottomans would find the damage from the previous day miraculously repaired. From his command tent, the young Sultan Mehmed watched. He was just 21 years old, but he possessed the patience of a seasoned commander. He didn't rage at the setbacks. He didn't order reckless, costly charges. He simply observed, learned, and adapted his strategy. When it became clear that a direct frontal assault was too costly, he decided to tighten the noose around the city, to starve it into submission. Inside Constantinople, the situation grew desperate. Food supplies dwindled. The constant bombardment, the sleepless nights, the sheer exhaustion, it all began to take its toll. Hope, once a roaring fire, was now just a flicker in the dark. Disease began to spread through the crowded, hungry city. Yet, they held on. The city's defenders had always believed the Golden Horn, their natural harbor, was secure, protected by a massive chain. But Mehmed was a genius of unconventional warfare. He ordered his men to build a greased log road, and over a single night, they hauled dozens of his smaller ships overland, bypassing the chain completely. The next morning, the Byzantines awoke to the horrifying sight of an Ottoman fleet inside their supposedly impenetrable harbor. Now, the city was being attacked from two sides. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, was a ghost on the walls. He walked them daily, moving from post to post, offering words of encouragement to his weary soldiers. He fought alongside them, sharing their danger, He knew the odds were impossible. He knew he couldn't win. All he could do was delay the inevitable, to fight for the honor of his dying empire. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on Mehmed. His own advisors began to whisper doubts. His generals warned of the mounting casualties and the drain on the treasury. The great powers of Europe were watching, many hoping he would fail. If this young sultan failed here, he wouldn't be remembered as a conqueror. He'd be a footnote, just another ambitious leader who overreached. Then, on May 22nd, the sky turned dark. A lunar eclipse, a blood moon, cast an eerie red glow over the besieged city. For the Byzantines, this was a terrifying omen. An ancient prophecy foretold that the city would fall when the moon was lost. Panic swept through the streets. People wept openly, believing God had finally abandoned them. For Mehmed, this was not an omen. It was an opportunity. He seized the moment, ordering his cannons to fire without pause. No rest, no mercy. The relentless, round-the-clock bombardment was the final blow. The already weakened walls began to give way in multiple places. The end was near. On May 28th, Mehmed gave his army one last night of rest. He allowed them to eat, to pray, to prepare themselves for what was to come, death or glory. Mehmed himself did not sleep. He rode through his camp, ensuring every detail was perfect for the final assault. At dawn on May 29, 1453, the attack began. It was a symphony of destruction. The first waves of attackers were the irregulars, the Bashibas. They were sent forward knowing most would die. Their purpose simply to absorb the first volley of arrows and to exhaust the last ounces of the defenders' strength. Then came the better-equipped Anatolian troops. And finally, when the defenders were at their breaking point, Mehmed unleashed his elite, the Janissaries. In the chaos of the final battle, Emperor Constantine XI was last seen stripping off his imperial purple insignia, drawing his sword, and charging into the thick of the fighting. A king choosing to die as a soldier. His body was never found. By midday, it was over. The crimson banners of the Ottoman Empire flew from the highest towers of the city. Constantinople had fallen. 1,000 years of the Roman Empire, an unbroken line stretching back to Augustus, had ended in a single brutal morning. Mehmed rode into the conquered city, not on a charging warhorse, but slowly, reflectively. He dismounted before the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He stooped down, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head, a traditional gesture of humility. He looked around at the city he had just conquered, not with the triumphant roar of a victor, but with the heavy silence of a man who now understood the true weight of his achievement. Because the noise of conquest is always loud, but the burden of responsibility is far, far heavier. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Constantinople was silent, not because the city had accepted its fate, but because it was utterly exhausted. Thick smoke coiled up from broken walls, and the streets, once thrumming with life, were now filled with the hollow echoes of a civilization that had just ended. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the city belonged to someone else. The conqueror, Sultan Mehmed II, rode through the legendary gates, but he didn't enter like a barbarian bent on destruction. He came as a ruler who understood the power of symbolism. His very first destination was Hagia Sophia. The great church stood magnificent and untouched, yet it seemed to tremble with the weight of both history and fear. Inside, thousands of civilians had taken refuge, their faces etched with terror, expecting the worst. But when Mehmed arrived, he ordered all violence to stop immediately. He dismounted from his horse. In a move that stunned everyone, he knelt on the cold marble floor, picked up a handful of earth, and sprinkled it over his turbanar gesture of humility before God. Then, he stood and declared that Hagia Sophia would now be a mosque. This wasn't an act to erase the past, but to begin a new chapter. The building would stand, not fall. It was a moment that would define his entire reign. Mehmed didn't rule through chaos, he ruled through structure. He quickly proclaimed protection for all of the city's inhabitants, regardless of their faith. Christians and Jews were not only allowed, but encouraged to continue practicing their religions. He knew a city was more than its walls, it was its people. So he sent out invitations, in some cases, orders for scholars, merchants, and artisans from across his empire to come and repopulate the city. Constantinople was being reborn as Istanbul, a vibrant, multicultural capital for a new era. The news of the city's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. It was a cataclysmic event. The old trade routes to the east were shattered. which dramatically accelerated the desperate search for new sea routes, a search that would lead Columbus to the Americas. For many historians, this moment marks the true end of the Middle Ages. But for Mehmed, this was just the beginning. Victory didn't soften him, it sharpened his ambition. He immediately set about reorganizing the Ottoman Empire, centralizing his power and drastically reducing the influence of the old nobility. From now on, law would be stronger than lineage. And then he did something that few conquerors had ever dared. He began to obsessively study his enemies. Mehmed amassed a vast collection of Greek manuscripts, protected fleeing scholars, and even invited renowned artists from Italy to his court. He would spend hours debating with Christian priests and philosophers, not to agree with them, but to understand them. He didn't see himself as just an Ottoman sultan. He adopted the title Kaiser I Rom, Caesar of Rome. He saw himself as the heir to the Roman Empire itself. But this kind of greatness always demands a heavy price. Inside the gilded walls of his palace, the initial celebration soon gave way to a cold, calculating fear. Princes were constantly watched. Brothers were seen not as family, but as potential threats to the throne. Mehmed believed that order and the stability of the empire mattered more than sentiment or even blood. He made a chilling decision. He legalized fratricide, allowing a new sultan to eliminate his brothers to prevent civil war. It was a brutal policy that secured the empire for centuries, but forever stained his legacy. As the years rolled on, Mehmed's ambition never waned. He continued to expand his empire both west and east. The empire of Trebizond fell. Serbia was subjugated. The powerful Republic of Venice, the Queen of the Seas, began to fear his name. In Rome itself, the Pope worried that Mehmed's gaze would soon turn to Italy. He seemed unstoppable. But the conqueror, the new Caesar, was aging. And history, it turned out, was not quite done with him yet. After conquering Constantinople, the world didn't just know Mehmed's name, they feared it. His ambition was no longer a question. It was a force of nature reshaping the map. He marched relentlessly, campaign after campaign. The Black Sea, once a crossroads of empires, became an Ottoman lake. Trebizond, the very last whisper of the Byzantine legacy, fell silent. Even the proud and powerful Republic of Venice, the Queen of the Seas, was forced to sue for peace. Mehmed was no longer a character in history's story. He was the author. But the higher you climb, the more alone you become. Within the gilded walls of the Topkapi Palace, Mehmed's trust withered with each passing year. He saw shadows in every corner, potential traitors in every face. His viziers, the most powerful men in the empire, rose and fell like the tides. Some were executed abruptly, their fall from grace swift and brutal. Others simply vanished, their names erased from the court records. For the Sultan, betrayal wasn't just a possibility. He considered it an inevitability. He built walls around cities, and then he built them around his own heart. As his empire expanded, his own body began to fail him. A chronic gnawing pain became his constant companion. The court physicians diagnosed it as gout, a disease of kings. But in the hushed corridors of the palace, others whispered a more sinister word: poison. Mehmed, ever the warrior, ignored both the diagnosis and the rumors. To him, rest was a form of surrender, and surrender was a word he did not understand. He had conquered cities through sheer will. Surely he could conquer the frailties of his own flesh. So, in the spring of 1481, despite his crippling illness, Mehmed prepared for one last, epic campaign. The army was assembled. The supplies were gathered, but its ultimate destination remained a closely guarded secret. The whispers started again. Was he marching on Italy to bring the Italian city-states to heel? Or was his target something far grander, far more audacious? Rome, the very heart of Western Christendom. The symbolism was potent, almost poetic. The man who had conquered the second Rome, Constantinople, now setting his sights on the first. But history is full of what-ifs. On the road near Gebze, not far from the capital he had conquered, Mehmed collapsed. The greatest conqueror of his age was brought down not by an army, but by his own body. The royal doctors were summoned in a panic. They tried every remedy, every treatment known to them, but nothing worked. On May 3, 1481, at the age of just 49, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, died. The official announcement was delayed. In an empire built on absolute power, the death of the sovereign is the most dangerous moment. It creates a vacuum, and power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. When the news finally broke, the chaos Mehmed had always feared erupted. His two sons, Bayezid and Sem began a desperate race to the capital to claim the throne. The Janissaries, the elite heart of the army, chose sides, and the palace itself became a battleground. Blood was spilled in the streets of the city he had captured, a grim fulfillment of the fratricide law he himself had enacted decades earlier. He had conquered mighty empires, but he could not conquer the fatal flaw of succession. Mehmed was laid to rest in Istanbul, the city he had transformed from a dying relic into the vibrant capital of a new world power. His tomb stands there today, a quiet monument far from the roar of the cannons and the crash of the walls he shattered. His legacy, however, is anything but quiet. He forged an empire that would last for centuries and fundamentally reordered the world. But the debate he ignited rages on. Was he a visionary builder of civilizations, a new Alexander, or was he a ruthless tyrant, driven by an insatiable hunger for power? Perhaps, like all great figures in history, he was both. History loves simple stories, heroes or villains, saints or monsters. But Fatih Sultan Mehmed was none of these. He was a ruler born at the crossroads of worlds, caught between East and West, between the medieval and the modern. His conquest of Constantinople wasn't just an accident of war. It was the culmination of obsession, intellect, and an unrelenting will. But he didn't just conquer the city, he transformed it. Under his rule, Istanbul blossomed into a vibrant center for trade, culture, and law. He didn't expel the conquered, he integrated them. Greek scholars were invited to stay and preserve their ancient texts. Jewish communities, fleeing persecution in Europe, found a safe refuge within the city's walls. Artists, architects, and thinkers from across the known world were given protection and patronage, so long as their work served the glory of his new state. Mehmed believed in absolute power, but he also believed in the power of knowledge. He was a man who surrounded himself with books, not just soldiers. Philosophy mattered to him as much as military strategy. Imagine this: a sultan who would debate theology with Christian patriarchs, study the complexities of Roman law, and commission portraits from Italian artists, all while meticulously planning his next campaign to conquer their very lands. This contradiction was the very essence of the man. He was merciless on the battlefield, a strategic genius who saw human lives as pieces on a chessboard. Yet, in his private library, he was a curious scholar, a polyglot who devoured texts on science, history, and art. His greatest strength wasn't just his formidable army or his massive cannons, it was his mind. A mind that could engineer the impossible and envision a new world order. But this same strength was also his greatest flaw. Mehmed saw the state as eternal and individuals as entirely replaceable. To him, love, family, and mercy were all secondary to the stability and glory of the empire. His famous laws, the Canonim, brought order and a clear structure to his realm, but often at the cost of personal freedoms and compassion. He was an architect of empire, but also a master of absolute, unquestionable rule. Even today, modern historians are divided. Some see him as the brilliant visionary who built a truly global empire, a bridge between civilizations. Others see the origins of a ruthless autocracy, a ruler who believed the ends always justified the means. But no one can deny this one simple fact: the world after 1453 was fundamentally different from the world before. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end one empire, it triggered a chain reaction across the globe. Trade routes that had existed for 1,000 years were redrawn overnight. New empires rose to challenge the old. The flood of Greek scholars fleeing west helped fuel the fire of the Renaissance in Italy. And at the heart of this global transformation was one man who simply refused to accept the word impossible. Fatih Sultan Mehmed did not just conquer a city, he conquered an entire era. His ambition redrew the map and reshaped the flow of history itself. And today, centuries later, his shadow still stretches across our world, a powerful reminder that greatness is rarely clean, never gentle, and never, ever simple. Legends are not born from comfort or compromise. They are forged by those few individuals willing to carry the immense weight of history on their own shoulders. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the figures who shaped our world.